Welcome to week number 4, strategy, section 3, selling your vision and plan for SI 627 IT leadership and management. The audio portion of the class will begin after the Jack Welch interview, so please follow the initial slides at the beginning and then click on the link to watch the Jack Welch video. The links will be live in the slide deck, so be sure to download that before proceeding. Thank you. Please review the agenda that provides the outline for the class. And note each of the sections. There are multiple videos in the class, so be sure to queue those up and watch them when it comes to that point in this recording. Also provided are some background rather on Jack Welch, so you can read through that. And following that are a set of discussion questions that we used for the in-class discussion that follows watching the video by Welch. Those questions will be put up again at the end of the video.
Love them to death and touch them. Get inside their skin. Excite them about what they're doing. Give purpose to their jobs and their lives. That's what this is all about. We spend most of our waking hours on these jobs. Make them fun, make them exciting, and reward that hell out of those who do the job you're asked them to do. Thanks a lot.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Okay. Let's pair up and talk about these 5 questions. Let's just take about 7 minutes to talk about these, and then we'll talk about them as a group, as a whole. Okay? So. Okay, so you heard a number of different phrases, words used in this video. The first is the strategy, execution, and people. What did he say? A top-down person is going to start with what? Strategy. Yeah. And then break that down into objectives, like we talked about in our class, and then give those as assignments. Right? What is Welch saying?
Doesn't he kind of throw it out the window? Doesn't care so much about strategy.
Yeah.
It's more about execution of people.
Yeah, and if you don't have the right people, you're not going to have the right execution. And if you don't have the right execution, what's the strategy worth anything? He's saying no. So he's not saying ignore strategy, but he's saying if you're not thinking about people and you're not thinking about execution, and one of his lieutenants who he mentioned tangentially in the video went on to be the CEO of Honeywell, and he wrote a book called Execution, which is what he learned from his time at GE about how to execute well. Okay? So you go through the same thing when you work through a course, right? You have a plan, you have to execute assignments. If you don't feel good about the class or good about the work that you're doing, what happens? Huh?
You don't execute.
Yeah, the execution suffers, right? Okay, he mentioned something about, first of all, he said everybody hates change. And then he mentioned this principle. Does anybody remember what this acronym stands for? WIFM, it's called for short? Yes, Anna. What's in it for me? People want to know what's in it for me. So if you look at the Phoenix Project, who's asking that? Yes.
pretty much the entire IT team is asking that about the new change process?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And Patty's about throwing her hands up, saying, you know, what's happening with this whole, you know, ticket system I put in place, it's, you know, being ignored. So nobody's happy with the status of what's in it for them. And Welch says that can be the kiss of death for any change initiative in an organization. And Phoenix is going through a huge change initiative. So Bill Palmer needs to do what? Yes, where it is.
I think well, it's not obvious, but I think he needs to make it clear what the value is, like why, like people need to have some sort of incentive aligned with what they're doing that contributes to Phoenix, what that means for their performance, and what that means for kind of the shape of the department.
Yes, explaining to his team what's in it for them, individual by individual. Michael Locke talks about this, you know, in terms of the manager, even the technology manager, having to worry about the atmosphere and the psychology of the team working well. Talks about that, you know, being, and many times the manager has to even be the counselor. Somebody comes in their office and says, you know, this organization is out to get me. This organization is not working well. How do we change that? And so a manager is in that interesting position, but explaining what's in it for people becomes then an important part of a manager selling the vision, selling the strategy, which is what we're focusing on in this class today. You're going to be doing that as teams with their senior manager presentation. You need to persuade a senior management team to do this project. And so part of it is going to be to explain to the senior management team what's in it for them. Does anybody know another word that's sometimes used to describe this in business?
Let's say quid pro quo.
Quid pro quo. That's close. Okay, that's close. What about with software products? What does the marketing department describe when it's about this, when it wants to sell new software products? What does Apple do when it wants to sell a new iPhone?
Upgrade.
Upgrade, but because why? New features. New features are not just for the sake of new features, but there's something that every product has to go through, an internal discussion about what are called features and benefits. How will this feature and this product benefit the users, whether the users are customers who are buying outside the company or whether they're the internal people using it. And that's a WIFM step, being able to explain the benefits in your project, in your product, in your service, in an organization. So whether you're managing a project in an IT department or you're an IT manager or you're the CIO, you have to understand this connection. And this is your strongest connection to the marketing department. They love you if you can talk this language, for example. Okay? He mentions differentiation. Did you catch? What does he mean by differentiation? He mentioned it wouldn't be popular in Copenhagen. Wouldn't be popular in the EU. Yes?
He said
Eric?
differentiation is essential for building great teams.
Yes, he said it's essential. That's right. But what is it?
He means like people with different thoughts and backgrounds
Yeah.
and interests and skills.
It could be the diversity of the team, for example. He uses a lot of sports analogies, and so he says that one of the goals of the manager is to field the best possible team. That if in American baseball, for example, if you're going to win the World Series, you have to have
hitters that are hitting above 300 or have many runs batted in, their statistics are very high. Their scores, their points, their grades are very high, right? And what he's saying is to have a winning team, you have to have people that score the highest. The Oakland A's figured out that it was on base percentage. If you had a team of people who were able to get on base no matter how they did it, they tended to win more games. And so differentiation is, how am I going to differentiate the people on my team or the people I want to hire for my team based on their batting average, for example, if I continue the same metaphor. But what is one of the key batting average measures you all have? Grade point average, GPA, right? What's that? Do you have how many have GPA on their resume? A few, not everybody. Okay. It's the most common statistic that's put on a resume, GPA. And one of the things you're trying to say to the prospective company of hiring you is, I'm somebody who hits a lot of home runs. Look at this score. Right? And so what Welch is saying is managers have to pay attention to that. He also talks about candor. He mentioned, what was the woman who worked there for 30 years? And she was being fired. That sounded, you know, somebody who was here for 30 years. I mean, you know. He's saying that if you're not being candid with people, you end up in situations, you know, like that. Now, there are ways of being candid, as we'll talk about in a little in a subsequent class, about how do you give good, constructive feedback that's candid, but kind. That's a hard balancing act to do, but it becomes really important if you're going to field that best possible team. Now, one of the ways to field the best possible team is hiring the best people you can, so you get people to, you know, come on that bus I talked about earlier. But what's the other way? Sorry?
Oh, I was gonna say, you said hire the best people. I think the next piece is getting them to work together.
Getting to work together, right? What else? Collaboration is very important on teamwork, yes. Training, right? Can you increase the skills or the performance of your existing people by offering training? Is the fact that the team not performing as well as you want it to perform, is it due to the fact that some people haven't gained certain skills they need yet? And a manager will say, I'm gonna get people in to do that training, or I'm gonna do that training myself, or I'm gonna have the person who's best on my team volunteer to do that training for the group. So gaining skills and through training becomes another way to build the best possible team. And then culture. You remember the discussion about Kidder Peabody, the investment bank? What was the culture there? Bonus, right? And it may be, you know, related to that is paycheck, right? Or raise, what raise am I getting? That was important to Jack Welch when he first started. In 1960, I think he said he joined GE for a salary of $10,000 a year. That probably raised a few eyebrows in this room when you hear what the salaries were at that time for engineers. But what did he say that can sink a business, an acquisition? Yes?
When cultures like clash.
Yes, when the cultures clash. That's the hardest thing to get right. What did he say? That if you get the spreadsheets right, you know, and you acquire businesses based on the numbers, but the cultures don't match, it's probably going to fail. So asking that, so a little bit later on today, we'll talk about culture and what the culture is and in an organization. And sometimes you'll find, you're probably already finding, when you choose an internship or you choose a company to go work for, what the culture is in that organization ends up being rather important. Ben, you look doubtful.
The idea of having much of a choice, we don't really, ideally we get a choice, but we don't.
But let's put it this way. If you had 2 job offers, how important a role would culture play in that decision?
Are all the other things even?
Yeah, it's the
It's
same.
assuming that all, yeah, assume the pay is the same, assume the commute is the same, you know, all that stuff, right? Everybody's heard of Glassdoor.com? Yeah, on Glassdoor, you can probably get an inside scoop on what the culture is. And whether you are satisfied in work you're doing with an organization over a long horizon of multiple years is going to largely depend on the culture and your own personal growth, you know, within that. So it's something that's worth paying attention to. Silicon Valley prides itself in having work hard, play hard cultures. I'll talk about that in a minute. But any other comments or questions about Welch and what he's doing? This will overlap and come back to us again in the staffing unit. He talks about that hiring the right team. Yes,
I
Adrian.
have a question. I mean, he talked about rewarding those who do well.
Mhm.
And is there a tension in that, and that you're always concerned about your budget? And so, how do you weigh those factors?
A smart organization will plan in its budget to have a bonus pool. Usually that bonus pool will be tied to how the organization as a whole does. For organizations that are publicly traded, having stock options, for example, is a natural way to do that, because if the organization does well and the stock price goes up, then everybody benefits who has shares of stock. And giving shares of stock, or what are called stock options, an option to buy a stock at a predetermined low price, becomes one way of getting what is called variable compensation, variable reward. But you need to build that into the budget. Ultimately, the CFO needs, the chief financial officer needs to do that for the organization as a whole. But in the IT department, you need to know, how much money do I have for salaries? How much money do I have for bonuses? How much money do I have for training, you know, for example? Because these become things that can fund your own department's growth. Okay? Mary Grace, you're up. I will hand this off if it works. There we go. Okay.
Clicker going.
Yeah.
Sweet. Let's see where we're going. Okay, that's me. Hi everyone, I'm Mary Grace. I am going to be walking through this past week's readings, largely covering a lot of the Phoenix project, and then some of the readings that we had about culture, as well as kind of like presentation skills. So kicking it off with a short discussion of the Phoenix project. So as we've been reading about, the project has launched and it's not going quite well for the organization. We see a lot of different internal systems that are falling short. There are a lot of miscommunications going on, and we're having some issues with customer loyalty from the fallout from this. We're also seeing some issues where they've instituted a number of standardized processes, but some of the negative personalities are coming into play, and we're seeing that even though they've set up some of these systems, especially at the end of the chapter, we see that there may be some short-sighted choices being made in order to prioritize expediency over kind of more systematized approaches. And then also we've had this long quest for the 4 weeks of work. We're finally at the 4th, focusing from Eric's comments on business projects, internal IT projects, changes in unplanned work. So Bill is on this quest to try to understand some of these broader principles, and we're kind of reaching this broader understanding of what are the things that are pulling at the strategy and pulling at the attention of the organization. With that in mind, a couple questions.
Excuse me, let me interrupt you for just a minute.
Yeah.
Don't read through the questions, let everybody just look at them for a minute, and then we'll come back to the 3 questions in the discussion time, okay?
Perfect, okay. So here's some questions. Am I allowed to say what they're on, or just they can read them?
You can give a
Okay.
30-second overview on this.
You guys can read them about our goals, etc. It's a real moment for everyone. Feel good about this. Okay, I think you guys have it. Awesome. Okay, so now we're at Be the Business. So here we're talking, there was a lot of different conversations about storytelling and the ability to convey information, convey value through stories. So in this case, you know, we talked about like the different ways, different parts of the business value how storytelling, what it says about their process. So I thought I liked this part where they're talking about how different parts within it use storytelling for talking about vision, other parts look at it with focus on revenue. But I think that they talked about like the benefits of really conveying like how what you want to do within an organization goes beyond just like ROI, like explaining the value, which I think touches on some of the stuff we were mentioning earlier, which is like what's in it for me. And then also then for IT specifically, a lot of the times IT will talk about improvements that they're making and frame it around like, okay, we're gonna have a lot of savings if we do this. But you know, the challenge here is to think about going beyond like, this project will save the organization a certain amount of money. Certainly organizations want that metric, but going a step further to then say like, this is the broader value we'll create for customers, processes, et cetera, in order to generate more buy-in. So here's some questions for you guys to ponder. This is your moment. And if I'm allowed to summarize this very briefly, I think the tension here is IT departments are poor at storytelling. How can we look at ways to improve that? Cool. And then, as a combination here with the 12 pieces of advice article that we had, and then this article on Steve Jobs' storytelling approach, a couple of shared points on this is the benefit of storytelling to grab an audience's attention. In particular, I think the 12 pieces article touches a lot on the authenticity piece, and people, you know, not being afraid to, you know, like share their approach and or like tell information in a way that's attention grabbing. And as well as, I think there's a big focus as well on Steve Jobs, how he likes to frame things with this setup, confrontation, resolution approach. So laying out a problem, usually it seems like he pitches it like, here's the landscape, here's the tension, and then only Apple is uniquely positioned for our product in order to solve this problem. And so by using that narrative arc, he became very popular for kind of his launch and his approach. Also his turtlenecks, so there's that too. Cool, so that in mind, some questions here about kind of this overlap of presentation styles, and kind of then thinking about some of the contextualized aspects of what were some of the strengths and rhetorical advices, and what does that look like in a regular context. So this is your reading moment. All right, and then final overview. We had 2 chapters from Being Geek, and in here the 2 chapters focused on different aspects of sort of like internal politics in an organization. One was focused on the interviewing piece, and so kind of looking at the motivations or kind of the way you might calibrate what the motivations are of someone who you're interacting with in an organization, and how you try to influence them or how you try to get them to build buy-in with what you are ultimately trying to convince them of, which is to hire you. And then similarly, this idea of the culture chart, looking at this differentiation between, yes, there's structure to where people sit in an organization, but then there's also sort of these informal politics of an organization, and largely understanding the informal politics is just as important as knowing the hierarchy, if not more, in order to find the change agents of an organization, particularly if you're in management or if you're trying to get buy-in for your project. And so this really emphasizes that need to have this ability to navigate politics. And then finally saying that, you know, the culture of the company can represent the undercurrent of ideas that exist within it. I think, you know, they talk about like, as well as like understanding the point when you want to leave, seeing how culture changes, and understanding how that reflects what the organization really is. Great, so this is your reading moment. And this is talking here about kind of like influence within peer leaders, and looking at how they influence the culture. So it's your moment. It's a nice little tie-in to the Phoenix Project, one of the questions. Influence side. Thanks. Cross-reading collaboration. All right, and now this is the audience participation part. So, in summary,
How do you think the misalignment of goals and or lack of empathy contribute to management mishaps during the Phoenix launch? Teeing this up for you all. So there are a number of instances where Bill tries to sound the alarm prior to the launch, that things aren't working out, but it seems like different people are trying for different things in order to they're playing their own games and they're not working together. What are your all's thoughts on that? Yeah.
I feel like people, or I think that the teams themselves are kind of more interested in playing like the blame game and like who has the hot tomato rather than figuring out like let's deal with the post-mortem later, like let's work on actually fixing it now and it doesn't matter who did it, let's just all like collaborate and figure out how do we get to the next phase. So right now they're spending so much time just being like, well, it's IT's fault, blah, blah, blah. And so since you guys have always been in the hole, like, you guys now have to like make up for it. So it seems kind of unproductive.
Totally agree.
I think it also kind of shows when Bill was trying to tell everyone, like, if we keep going forward with this, we're gonna have so many issues. What do you think is more important? And they're like, oh yeah, Phoenix, we need to launch it now. And then once they launched it, there were so many other issues, and then they blamed them again. And it's like, well, I told you this was gonna happen, and they're like, well, it's your fault. Like, their goals were all just misaligned, and just ruined everything in the end. So
Totally.
I think Bill's been pretty naive to the whole process. Just from taking the job and thinking that he could do it, from thinking that they actually had the capability to launch Phoenix successfully with the amount of problems that they've had. I mean, is there anyone in this room who would think that they would actually have taken Bill's job when Steve offered it to him?
I mean, I think Bill's in a tough position, right? Like, he seems back to the tactics side, right? Like, he seems like he's thinking the right things. He's trying to put the right steps in place. But the fact that I think the marketing team was so hell-bent on the optics of not launching and how problematic that would be, they didn't look at like the disastrous after effects of it. I think everybody was looking at managing their own benefits, marketing, and sort of like that, business development team probably wants to say at their end of year goals, like, we set up this timeline and we launched this new product to market without seeing if they really had the underpinnings. To be honest, this all seems like healthcare.gov to me. Like, that's what I keep thinking this is like, we gotta get it out by this deadline, but does the website collect data, And so it feels like one of those things where they're managing on some sort of artificial timeline that they're, different people are playing their games for what they need for their own like end of year performance review, but they're not talking to each other.
What would Jack Welch say to Steve?
I mean, again, I think it comes down to people, right? And
Listen. He said it 3 times.
See you later, to be honest.
Sorry?
I think he would say see you later.
Yeah.
Jack Welch would.
Oh, would Jack Welch have taken the job? Yeah, probably not.
He would not.
but I think the thing is like, so if Bill doesn't take this job, whoever takes the job, I don't think even if it's necessarily Bill's personality, maybe he is naive. He's ultimately defaulting to Steve, but Steve's not pushing back. And unless the CEO does something, like, he can only say so much, but he doesn't have the ultimate decision-making authority.
So, I've been wondering about what the repercussions are in the other players, the other executives. I mean, we're reading a novel and it's based on the first character of it, but I don't know if any of you have any insights about, like, everything seems to be Bill's fault, but what about the marketing or the CEO? Because in the end, it was them who decided to launch despite all the advice from the experts. They failed.
I think it's tough because I think he inherited this problem, and so Bill ultimately wasn't in the meeting rooms when they ignored IT and all the build up to this, and now he's stuck with fixing it on the outcome. I think that like, Steve is ultimately has to respond to the board, and like the board wants it, and they have shareholders, right? They're public, and so he's responsible to the shareholders. And so Steve's getting these pressures from the market that he needs to act in this way, but they're just ignoring. I think, in my opinion, this is ultimately a failure of internal communication to really listen to the people who are in charge of the mess. Like, Steve needs to launch by what the board wants, or they could fire him. So I think that they all think that they can like fix it as they go. But that said,
There is more justice in the book, so I'll just say stick with it. And you'll see how these things pan out. When is the best time to negotiate terms about the work?
Before you do it.
When you're offering, right?
Yeah.
In the beginning. Did Bill negotiate terms?
No.
Oh,
Well,
really?
he didn't want the job though.
He didn't want the job, right?
He like.
And he had to be, but even more power, right?
Yeah.
If Steve was in a position, or Bill put Steve in a position where Steve had to really sell this job, persuade Bill to take it, then at that time, Bill could have said, this is what I need in order to be successful.
He also didn't ask like any questions like why the
Yeah.
person before him was leaving, like
Right.
what the circumstances were, like yeah, to your point, he was very naive going into
Yeah,
it.
and he didn't even, like, when he went in, there wasn't even a formal announcement about his ascension to the role.
I think one of the things they're struggling about too is their internal IT, like their internal processes are terrible, right?
Yeah.
The fact he doesn't have a laptop that even works, I think is like symptomatic of the fact that the organization's very disorganized, not to mention the fact that they can't launch a major product. Like it seems like they can't do the basics, let alone like launch some sort of enormous transformative thing to market, which I think is like setting up a lot of warning flags on their viability.
I would agree with that, like, at the point of negotiation, would have been the time to like ask for things, but I also don't think that he knew what he needed at that point in time.
Or what he should ask for, right? I mean, he did go back and ask for more staff, but that was already after he accepted the job and was doing the job, right?
Probably the best I think he could have done is some version of due diligence before he accepted. Like I think like the potential opportunity would be if he could talk with people who had it before or talk with the teams before he accepts to try to understand what the undercurrent of problems are in order to try to see what he needs to ask for. But he would have needed time and he would have needed to have felt like he had the political capital to do that sort of due diligence. To that point, why do we think that IT is bad at storytelling? Why is IT bad at making a case for itself? This is open-ended. There's no wrong answer. Yeah.
Well, I think just from the other readings, like it sounds like from before, their function was really to like execute on strategic goals rather than being the people that define the strategic goals. And I think there's usually like some correlation between the people that are setting the strategy and like creating a narrative around that. So it's like if you're just kind of purely like an operational function, you're like, all right, I'm just carrying this out. I don't need to make this sound. I don't need to do buy-in because someone already is forcing me to do it. But I think that now, like, I think that was kind of what the reading too was saying, was like, if you're trying to set up the strategy, then you need to get people to buy into it. So you need to craft it better than just saying like, here's an iPad, like we're now giving you iPads. It's like, oh, we want you to do X, Y. So it's kind of interesting that like as you get more involved, the closer you get to like that part of the business, the more important it is for you to be able to communicate that.
And I think it leads to this idea of like, you need to have someone in the room to advocate too. Like if it's going to fall to you to implement, you need someone in the room when they're making the discussions. It shouldn't just happen to you. Yeah.
So this is a bit stereotypical, but don't you think people tend to self-select? And the people that are better at storytelling tend to go into the marketing departments, and the people that like to sit by themselves in front of a computer terminal go into IT.
I think there's definitely like the stereotype, which is not always true, but there's definitely like a stereotype of kind of like the technical person who was really good at creating the concept, but not good at getting the idea, getting the buy-in. So maybe this is, part of the takeaway too, is like being good at both really matters. You have the best product, but if you can't sell it.
I think as part of that, a lot of the decision makers are probably not the most technically savvy people. And so if you have to explain a value that requires a technical explanation, you have to work that much harder to sell it. You have to talk more in metaphor than you otherwise would.
Which is what the 12 Things article said, is like avoid jargon.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for a lot of disciplines, is being able to convey what you're doing in a way that you can get the layman to understand in order to continue to get the buy-in.
What happens when they go off to off-site to a bar or to lunch? I think there's been a couple scenes.
There was one where he went off and they had the beer right before he went back and like maybe angered part of the department, but I think people are more casual, informal. Are you saying that they start to build connections or bonds?
What happens, I think, and you probably have all had this experience, right? So you go back to see your family at a holiday and everybody gets together. Typically, everybody's telling stories or telling jokes, right? Or you go to a bar, people are telling jokes. You go to a party, people are telling stories. We're telling stories all the time, regardless of whether we're technical or non-technical, but it doesn't tend to happen in the workplace. If you ask the question, if Bill was to ask the question, so tell me a story about when things worked really well in IT. Tell me when that happened. Could they relate that story? And then the converse, tell me a story when things really crashed and burned before Phoenix, right? Tell me when things went really bad. What happened then? How did we respond to notice? Can you retell that story? And then if you can tell the difference between something that worked really well and something that worked really poorly, now you're using metaphor to differentiate how we might do things differently. Okay? So there's a lot of stories in organizations. Part of the challenge is how do you find them? I would say throw a pizza party or a beer blast. You'll probably start hearing the stories.
That's true. And the very last thing, again, this one's personal experience based, but how would you all look to identify peer leaders within an organization, who you would look to most influence the culture, and then what makes those types of people stand out? Think back to past organizations, either people you respected or people that, either if you felt like you were a peer leader, or if there were people who you felt like you looked to for questions, or people who are always sort of rallying the troops within an organization, even at a junior level. Kind of what were those distinction factors?
I think a level of honesty, back down to candor. It's like, having talked to a lot of different people, a lot of different organizations in my career, the people who you know you're going to get the honest answer from, you ask them a hard question, are the people who you're going to look up to, and who's actually influencing, who's just like tell stories and not just giving me an honest answer. No, I want to hear this, how it's going to affect me, and what's in it for me is what kind of honesty I can get out of a person and a leader.
My experience just with like small businesses, like my boss was one of those people, and he was always in and out of everyone's room. So like, I don't know, someone who is constantly in contact with everyone and like popping in, and I don't know, whether it's serious business work or casual conversation. I think that's an indication of someone who's critical to the organization.
The empathy piece is huge, honesty, other traits. Also, anyone who hasn't contributed yet.
So one of the things that Hewlett-Packard made part of their culture was MBWA, management by walking around. And the culture was that if any manager stopped by your desk, you had to have something that you were working on the desk that they could play with or pick up and look at. Remember, it was more of an engineering environment. It'd be harder to do that with software, but there's probably ways to do that as well. But remember, what did Jack Welch say? Get out of your office, go walking around, meet people, listen. And so that's exactly what you're touching on here, is that if you walk around and have more conversations with people as a manager, you're probably going to get a sense of what the real issues are, what the real opportunities are, and what the culture is in the organization. Some people argue that an organization is the sum of its stories. There's a nonprofit organization called City Year in Boston. And what City Year does is they've collected what they call foundational stories. And some of them are stories about themselves, and some of them are general stories. If you go to their website, you can read the 15 stories. And what they say to new employees or prospective employees is, if you want to know what we're about, read the stories. Because at the end of each story, they have a moral, the conclusion that they've drawn from it. And so the culture of City Year in Boston is the sum of those foundational stories. Interesting approach. There's not an employee manual that says, if you want to learn about our organization, read this employee manual. No, just read the stories.
I think this also comes back to this idea of informal networks, that peer leaders tend to be people who either exemplify kind of like a positive attitude towards the work, and or through their hard work and honesty are doing a very good job. I think people tend to look towards them. And I think that's one of the things too, is like you see organizations when they've gone sour, when they start to lose their people who were kind of key culture, key people who carried the culture. I remember someone was talking about grad school, and they were talking about how like, at least in the business school, with an organization where you have roughly like 400 people per grade, there's roughly about 100 people who are super involved in a lot of things, who kind of carry the culture, lead a lot of the clubs. And this is an example of like that going wrong, but if you think about that translated to an organization, the people who are involved in a lot of things, when you lose those people, you've lost the organization. And so I think kind of like understanding those dynamics is also a big takeaway that I saw. Yeah.
I also think peer leaders, title peer leaders, is very subjective, because from my personal experience, there are peer leaders that you consider on your level, and those peer leaders on your same level of experience in the company is not the peer leaders that the managers look at. So if there's a director who thinks this person is a peer leader because he's doing excellent performance, he may not be a peer leader amongst the same level of people, because it usually cause, you kind of need different type of actions to be considered a peer leader by the director, compared to your actual same level peers.
Yeah.
That's what I found quite interesting about identifying peer leaders in an organization.
I would agree. I think that's on like a philosophical level, right? There's like this idea of like high performers, and then also people who kind of carry the culture. You know, in a best case scenario, that person's both. But like seeing an organization, I think ideally good management also understands the dynamic piece. As people move through an organization, I think people always say different levels, different traits seem to matter more.
Okay, thank you. Good job. Okay, I said we would talk about culture, and since we were just talking about that on the last question, this is from a book on culture. The references in the notes section. And one way this author was looking at corporate cultures was, what's the feedback speed, fast or slow, and then what's the degree of risk, low or high. And sort of this macho type culture is, fast but a high risk. Slow and low is a process oriented, maybe tending towards a more bureaucratic type culture. Venture company here, and then this is one that appears in a number of organizations that work hard, play hard. Where do you think Silicon Valley companies are? Ben? Here?
Yeah.
Some here, some here?
Move fast, break things, that's tough guy.
Yeah. Right, it's Mark Zuckerberg, yeah, move fast, break things, right? One of the problems is with this is you got to be right all the time. What is the tolerance for the organization for getting it wrong? And also, how do you build a great sense of camaraderie? Team collaboration was, I think, brought up before. It's hard to have a sense of collaboration if all you're doing is looking to the leader to execute things well. And what happens is that sometimes the collaboration is just commiseration. We're all going to go out to the bar and complain, about what decisions, Zuckerberg or Sergey Brin have made. Right? But this is one way. There are other ways to look at it. And they give some examples here for advertising, sales organizations, advertising organizations, a pharma, and then banks or governments. As examples of cultures. Now, some of those are stereotypes. You're going to see some variation on others, but thinking about which culture would you feel most comfortable working is an interesting thought experiment to do. So this was an early model, as I mentioned. And then, what are some cultures that you can think of that are not on that? What about internship experiences? Have you had internship experiences that have a different sense of culture than this? One of these? Yes, Swandan.
So in my internship experiences, most of the culture has been on the work hard, play hard quadrant. Just because most of the people on my team, or at least the managers, use like the concept of servant leadership. So they try to decentralize the decision making as much as possible, and like we talked about, like the MBWA, they do that a lot as well.
So servant leadership is a good concept. I think we'll come back to that one. Yeah, where does servant leadership exist on this chart? You know, certainly if you go into Google's headquarters in Mountain View, California, which I've done a number of times, you know, some of the first things you see are the play aspects. You know, you see the swings, the beanbag chairs, the pool table, the ping pong table, the restaurant bar. These are things that say this is a fun place to be. And so part of that culture is to give that sense that, yeah, you want to come work here because not only are we working on cool things, but look, this is just a cool environment to be a part of. So they're deliberately giving that message. In the early days of Microsoft, one of the parts of the culture was the stocked refrigerator. Every refrigerator in every department was typically filled with free drinks and that you could help yourself to. Yes, Mary? Yes.
So they still have all the free drinks.
Sorry?
They still have all the free drinks.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting cultural pieces there is that Microsoft went through a period of time where they had a kind of like everyone's out for each other mentality.
Yes.
Where they had like rank and stack reviews where like top people got dropped if you weren't at the higher point, so people weren't collaborating. And with the recent CEO, they went through this rebrand of the culture where it's you're evaluated just as much by how much you help others to be successful.
Yes.
Or like you comment on how your work has directly impacted others. So I think like one of the things that this doesn't really lean on is kind of the like more collective aspects. This feels very individualistic as far as like risk and feedback, but looks less at like the collective piece of success.
Yeah, what's the collective dimension?
I feel like IKEA would probably not really fall on a lot of these, any of these 4 quadrants.
An IT department.
No, IKEA.
IKEA.
They're very speech.
Yeah, some of the cultural aspects of companies depends on the culture in which the company grew up. It does make a difference. Okay, in the Mays article, there were these 12 pieces of advice. I think Mary Grace touched on a number of them. You notice that story is on that list, as well as a number of other things. Does every presentation or every persuasion or sales type event about technology or IT departments touch on all of these things? No. But are some of them, you know, can you touch on some of them? Yes. So this is from the TED blog, and there's a TED talk behind it as well. Any questions before we break? Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. Okay, everybody's complete. Oh, well, wait until the rest of the group comes in. But you all completed a SWOT exercise, and I asked one of the students from a prior year. He did a fairly good example on one sheet of paper on Google. So I figured I'd put this up as an example. Some of you use similar approaches. of indicating, color coding in terms of things that were similar, things that were unique, and then, his add to this was the things in red in terms of what's missing. Did anybody have any difficulties with the exercise or difficulties finding things? Okay. I know some people posted in the discussion section and then didn't post in Canvas. Don't worry, whatever the time stamp is on where you posted it first, that's what counts for the assignment. This was Brian's assignment. He also had a succinct answer to this too, which was also valuable. So in other words, if you apply the 3x3 principle to this exercise, is okay, how can you answer the exercise with the minimum number of words or the minimum charts if you were going to show senior managers, the results, for example. Okay, let's jump into the topic for the day, which is convincing others to go with you. So this is the persuasion part, or the sales part, which has similarities to when you go through the interview process. In that case, you're the product, and you're selling yourself to the hiring organization, hiring manager. In Phoenix, we're now through part 1, so we're through chapter 16, and we've got another chunk coming up this week. Things continue to get interesting in the story, and as I said there, you'll find that some of the things take until the very end to be resolved, but there's some other things resolved intermittently as well. We now know the 4 types of work. So this last one was added as unplanned work. So which type of work is killing IT at Parts Unlimited?
Unplanned work.
Sorry? Unplanned work. There just seems to be, unplanned work seems to be flooding in on a regular basis and derailing then the other types of work.
They're not very good at video, to be honest.
They are slowly getting better, at it, and certainly in the prioritization part of this. But they're also starting to recognize one of the principles of what's called lean management, which originated in the manufacturing realm and is being applied to IT in this book, and that is work in progress. Work in progress is a killer. That the more things you have in the midst of work in an organization, the more it constrains your ability to do other things. And then push and pull effects as well. If you flip to the back of the Phoenix Project book, you'll find summaries of these discussions. And so we were introduced in chapter 7 to the 3 ways. In chapter 15, which we had this past week, a discussion of the first and the second way. So this is again based on lean manufacturing. That the first way is to have fast flow, meaning you minimize work in progress. And then the second way is that you cut the sources of unplanned work. In this case, Bill might want to lock up the marketing department. But where is unplanned work coming from? And how can it be constrained? And it seems to fall a lot on Brent's lap. And then he ends up being the bottleneck in the process. Then the third way is having a culture of experimenting and learning. So here, culture and a mindset shift is something that's needed at Phoenix. And as somebody, as you mentioned earlier, it's Phoenix, the organization is now stuck in blame mode. Nobody wants to be caught in blame, as a target of blame, but everybody seems to want to assess blame wherever they can. And the IT department seems to be the main place where blame is getting assigned. And so shifting that mindset from how do we avoid blame to how do we have more experimenting and learning is a pretty important shift, because what happens when you experiment? Fail, right? And that, you know, the fundamental tenet of a scientific experiment is the null hypothesis, right? That you assume that it's not true, not working until proven otherwise, right? So if the goal of the experiment is to fail and to learn so that the next experiment is better and builds on that all the more. And the great example of this, I think I may have already mentioned, is Thomas Edison, who had 10,000 experiments to develop the light bulb. And somebody asked him, how do you feel about having 10,000 failures? And he said, I didn't fail. He said, I found 10,000 ways it doesn't work. So that's learning from the experiment. That's a mindset shift that has to happen at Parts Unlimited. Right now, it doesn't look like that's going to happen. But there'll be some shifts that are happening. Okay, so the key question for today is that given a well-researched IT strategic plan that we've been studying in prior weeks, how do we now sell this IT strategy to the senior management team? How do we get the support and the budget and the people and the commitment and time to now execute this IT strategy? Okay. So the work has been done, the presentations have been prepared, and now it's a matter of selling it to the organization. And so we've been traveling along this path, and selling in red here is actually a 360-degree event, because it's selling it to the people who are going to be impacted by the change down in the organization. It's going to be selling it to your peers in other departments and the peers who work with you in your department, and then selling it up the line to middle management and ultimately to senior management as well. There's selling that's happening in all different directions. If you're feeling uncomfortable about selling, stay tuned, there's more to come. So some of the key terms that we've been talking about, we looked at measures, we looked at objectives, KPIs, and setting up these types of measurable goals and approaches is part of trying to be clear about, well, how do you know IT strategy is succeeding? How are we going to, what does success look like? That's a key consulting type question. Can you describe what success looks like? If you were sitting in Parts Unlimited and somebody asked you, describe for me what Phoenix success looks like. Dylan?
Well, I guess, like, according to the story, because it kind of seems like it's different from the HP idea of what, like, IT success is. But from the book, it kind of sounds like how can IT facilitate us entering into the new stage without being a bottleneck?
Okay, good. Other observations? Very good.
I think the negative thing is that it keeps changing, because I think first success was increased revenue, increased sales, increased customer satisfaction. And then when that fell apart, and it's like success is not leaking data and not being reliable. And then when that's still a struggle, then like success is like faster resolution. And I just think there's like, they have internal goals and then they have external ones, but they keep moving the benchmark.
And did you notice the shift from accomplishing things to avoiding things? And when you have a shift from accomplishment to avoidance, it's very hard to have a positive view of success. As a matter of fact, I think you would be defining success as the absence of failure. But is that really what success is about? Who joined you?
Well, I was going on the same line, but if I was sitting at Parts Unlimited right now, the success would be making the operation easier with the newer system instead of making it more difficult. But the Phoenix being so buggy made it so much harder for all the stakeholders, including dealerships and the customers, to operate like what they had been doing normally. But instead of using the system, they were utilizing the paper ticket system when they're making purchases, which is kind of going backwards from the current state.
Okay, good. Eric, you had a comment?
I
was gonna make a quick comment to the fact that I used to work in banking and compliance, and so, trying to avoid something is like pretty inherent, and I don't think that that means that that's a negative culture or not the way to approach it, but also like striving for outstanding versus a satisfactory rating could be seen as
Yeah,
kind of like the
yeah.
flip side of that.
Kind of many organizations define themselves based on the customer rating.
Yeah.
How are we gonna get a better customer rating, for example? But notice that the word better is a positive. And one of the challenges of managers sometimes is if you hear a negative goal, how can you flip it and interpret that, translate that into a positive goal? You may not be changing the mechanics of it, but the mindset becomes totally different when you flip it. Ben,
I was just about to say, could you also say, your IT strategy is succeeding and nobody's going to notice it, right? Because nothing's falling apart.
Right. We used to have what we called the deodorant theory of IT operations. That when it works, nobody notices. But when it doesn't work, everybody notices. And so the absence of criticism, it often means that, IT operations at least is running well because it becomes invisible. But a positive flip on that, as we'll see as we go through this, is can you deliver faster, better ways of working? Can you enable new things to happen that weren't possible before? And what does your list of new possibilities look like? I'll touch on that in a minute with a story. We've looked at org charts. So at the beginning we started off with the Parts Unlimited org chart, and Michael Lopp has talked about the culture chart. This is this type of social network analysis has been around actually since the 1950s. They used to do this by hand, if you can imagine. But if you track who talks to who, or who writes who a note, or even you analyze the email system, who writes an email to who copies whom, or whatever, what are all those connections? LinkedIn actually used to publish this. You could actually see your personal social network in a map of what it looked like. They stopped doing that. I think because some of it became unreadable because you just had too many connections on the various levels. But the thing that this says is that the connections in an organization are much more varied than the org chart. There are more conversations happening in an organization than just what's represented in the org chart. So as I said, this has been around for a while. And then Lopp's culture chart from being geek, I would say being geek, is asking what does the organization value, who creates this value system, who contributes high value, who is most aware of the value being created. So this is interesting because it's like 4 different perspectives on value in an organization. But also Lopp says that cultures are built on stories. So similar to the city year example I gave before, he says that if you ask where the stories are and what the stories are in an organization, you can probably start to get a handle on the culture. Tom Peters argued that you could find out the culture of an organization by walking down the hallways in 10 minutes. I thought that was pretty impressive. But what is it? Is it quiet? Is it dead quiet? Are there lots of chatter and conversation happening? What type of conversation? Is it whispering in the corner that's going on? You can get a sense of the culture just by walking around. Again, this management by walking around, you can find out about the culture of an organization if you're an outsider by walking around as well, to the degree that they let you walk around. And the culture chart is in contrast to the organization chart, just like the social network chart is. It's all of the informal and personal relationships, conversations that are happening in an organization, and that if you're looking to sell your strategy, being aware of where the key conversations are in an organization becomes a part of your selling strategy. who do I need to talk to make sure this goes through? I can bet you that one of those people is going to be in the finance department. You know, how am I going to ensure that this is going to get funded? What are my chances of getting this funded? Can you assign a probability to it? It's a great question to ask a finance person. And then, so that's what I just said essentially. Knowing your audience and knowing the power dynamics as well. So are there power dynamics going on in Parts Unlimited? Quite a bit, right? You know, if you were to walk into Sarah's office, if you were able to walk into Sarah's office and suggest something to do, you know, if she viewed it as a way that she could use it against another department and elevate her own standing, then she'd probably adopt it. But if it meant she had to do extra work to make something happen and wasn't really going to gain much from it, she doesn't have, you know, doesn't have time for you. Okay, persuasion and influence. So Cialdini has this wonderful influence quiz, and if you go to the website, you can take his quiz, and it's interesting because some of the questions he asks are not questions that the answers are not what you might expect. So you have two ideas to present. Which do you present more first? The more costly one or the less costly one? Sorry?
The more costly one.
Yeah, the more costly one. Because the less costly one is going to seem much more attractive after you present the more costly one, right? Now be careful, because if you want to sell the more costly one, then you have a greater chance of being rejected with this strategy. Is it better to tell somebody what they will gain by accepting your idea, or what they will lose by dismissing it?
Gain.
How many say gain? How many say lose? The losers have it.
Aversion.
Yeah. I answered this gain, by the way. So this is one I was surprised at. What's this going to cost you in terms of what you're going to lose is actually ends up being a more persuasive thing. If your idea has strengths and weaknesses, when should you present the weaknesses, early or late? How many say early?
Early.
One of the things that says is if you identify the weaknesses sooner, then you let the air out of somebody's argument that you haven't considered some risks or weaknesses.
And you can close with strengths.
Then you go with strengths, right? But this says you at least made an honest assessment, right? So after somebody's praised your idea, what should you do immediately after you say thank you? Turn them into a champion. Please tell somebody else. You know. What's the single most productive thing you can do to get somebody to act on your new idea?
Make it was their own.
Make them think it's their own. Make sure you know that you've acted on one of their ideas in the past. This is a New York mainstay. We call it the favor bank. I worked in New York for a number of years, and the favor bank operates that if you do things for people, you're putting deposits in the bank account, and at some point then you can ask for favors, and you can make withdrawals from the account. And it's literally like somebody's keeping a ledger on this. Yes, Erin?
They use that in the survey methodology too. Like they'll send you a prepaid something
Yes.
or other.
Yeah.
And then you like feel guilted into taking the survey afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And that's more successful than if you have like a voucher sent to you after you've completed the survey.
Yeah. Guilt is a powerful thing. Right. How do you deal with people that you suspect will be critical of your ideas?
Bring them along.
Bring them along. Meet with them ahead of time. The last thing you want to do is have the argument about your idea in the meeting. Okay, he identifies the 6 principles of influence and persuasion. This principle of reciprocity, I already mentioned, the favor bank. Commitment and consistency is another one. Social proof. We tend to go with who we like. We have deference to the expert, and so that's the authority role with persuasion, and the scarcity. And this power of losing out can be I think we met this a week or two ago about, I think Martha Heller mentioned this in her book, that the CEOs sometimes go and hire a chief digital officer not because they don't like what the CIO is doing, but because they're afraid of losing out on what new technology changes are happening in the world. Yes,
does the liking principle here also cover the fact that we like people who we see as similar to ourselves?
Yeah, exactly. But if you think about people who you respect or like, you are more likely to agree with an argument that they're making or pitch that they're making. Interestingly, so I was a Microsoft Imagine Cup judge for 10 years, and we used to have the college teams come and present their technology idea that they had developed over the past 9 months. And these were teams from all around the world. The teams that did the best picked somebody to be on their team who happened to be in marketing. They were studying marketing, and they had that person do the presentation. Because the engineers tended to love the details too much and would get lost in the details. So they would be there to answer back up any questions, so if we asked a particular technical question, they could respond and answer. But the marketing people ended up building that rapport with the audience more readily, because that's stuff they think about. Very recent.
But similar to one of the stories you hear often about Nike, students are made at Nike because it's such a marketing-led organization, that they often talk about in order to be successful in the organization, you need to be able to tell the story of what you want, and that includes their technical teams and their operations teams, that they really emphasize that in order to get anyone to listen, because marketing runs the business, that you have to tell the story.
Yeah, right. That's true. And marketing people, as somebody indicated earlier, naturally tell stories, and good advertising is good stories. All right, the favor bank I already talked about, and this article, he's a social psychologist, so it's a rather interesting article on persuasion. And then these are strategy questions that you can discuss with various stakeholders as you're going around building support for your IT strategy. And particularly being sure you understand what their pain points are. Or this question at the end here, what should be on our start doing list and what should be on our stop doing list? For an IT manager or an IT department to ask that is draws in the stakeholders, and they typically have pretty strong opinions about this. And it's good to uncover those. The salespeople call this uncovering the objection. If you can uncover and find out what the objection is, then you can respond to the objection. Again, if you're making your final presentation to the senior management team trying to get the funding for this, you don't want to then be surprised by objections at that point. Remember in the SWOT exercise we talked about one of the ways you can identify strengths and opportunities in particular is to ask customers. So what do you see as our strengths as an organization? Internally as well. So Bill and Wes go and meet with the CFO, and they have the same questions. What do you? Well, they ask him in particular, what does success look like for the organization? How do you measure success for the organization? And then they think about how they might contribute to those. That's what's called an alignment question. But John Pesky, the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, what would he say about that number 6 question?
Security over freedom.
security overall, right? Yeah, he's definitely got the security banner, and Eric has a few choice words, for him before they finally had a meeting of the minds about that. Not that security is not important, but if security is going to drive what the organization does, it's not as likely to innovate and develop new products. Okay, the Whiffam principle I talked about is, this is part of making your case, and it's a key stakeholder question. If you can describe what's in it for me, or Whiffam for short, and that's being able to describe the benefits. If we do this project, here's what benefits the organization is going to get. Here's what benefits your department is going to get if we do this. This is why it's important for us to do this project. And then what are you describing? You're describing what's in it for them, the department. And sometimes if you have competing projects, being able to describe benefits in relative terms, well, this one has greater set of benefits, and isn't that more important, can be a way of choosing or gaining support for one project over another. Now, what about the naysayer? This is the person who is always going to take a negative perspective on things, sometimes called the curmudgeon or the sourpuss in more colloquial language. But this is the person who tends to look at the negative side of every possibility. And key responses like this are, that'll never work here. We've never done that before. Certain types of things, and these are people who can let the wind out of your sails, to push another metaphor. Meeting with them in advance, building alliances is important. Having the data evidence that you can lay out, particularly for your chief financial officer, is important. And then this technique of going around the table, I've put a link to the story I wrote on this, but essentially there was a very vocal naysayer at Save the Children who was very negative on the IT department, such as sound like Phoenix. And was saying, we ought to do this, this, and this. And everybody else was quiet in the room. This was like a multi-department meeting. And so I asked, what do you think? What do you think? And we went around the room, and everybody else supported something different than what the naysayer was saying. And at the end of going around the room, the naysayer says, I withdraw my objection. Because it was clear they were not with the majority, the vast majority as well. So sometimes just asking the question around the table, what do you think, becomes an interesting way of dealing with the conflict, rather than having a head-on argument with the person that's raising the objection. You're crowdsourcing the answer with your own, whoever the team is, the group is in the meeting. The other is arguing at the problem, and the other story that I put the link is that I worked for a president of a company who was a real son of a bitch. I mean, he would, we would ask questions of his assistant, is this a good day or a bad day? And if it was a bad day, we wouldn't go in and ask for something, because we know that the answer was going to be not only be no, but you're going to get drilled into the ground. And I had to go in and say, here's our list of priorities, and we can't do them all. And he started, at first I was sitting opposite him, and he started, right at me, and so I literally got up and walked around the desk next to him, and I put the test paper there, and I said, so how would you put that in a priority order? It's a really terrible problem. And we're both yelling at the problem then. But then he became a collaborator in prioritizing the projects. So rather than this being about me and him, or me against him, it was together we're going to yell at the problem and deal with the problem together. So physically, moving around the desk, you can do that metaphorically as well, to move around the desk, is argue at the problem, not at the person, is another technique. So anticipating these conflicts and working through them, we'll have a later class on this as well. I threw a story here and another story in the middle of this as an example. This poster that's on the right-hand side was hanging on my door at the International Red Cross. It was done at a meeting in Kuala Lumpur on December 6th in 2010. So this is soon after I had started, like 6 months after I had started in the organization. And we said our goal is we're going to assist 15 national societies, so these were country offices, to cross the digital divide by the end of the year. And we accomplished those 15 by October of the next year. So we did it in almost 10 months from when we set that. But the ceremony we had is an idea I got from Tracy Kidder, who wrote the book, The Soul of the Machine. He actually wrote a number of books, but in The Soul of the Machine, he talks about the engineers signing up to build a particular product. And so we had a flip chart in the front of the room when we described what it is we wanted to do, and people asked their questions, and we debated back and forth. And I said, okay, here's the pen, here's the flip chart. Are you signing up to agree that we're going to work together to do this objective? And everybody came up and signed their name, because these are all the people who signed the sheet. And then when we achieved it, I sent this photo out to all of them and said, we committed to do this, we did it. But that ceremony of signing up became a physical representation of committing to work on the objective. And so signing up can be a very powerful thing. Yes? David?
So it was part of the negotiation coming to an agreement as to like the actual number of societies you're gonna help, like, you know,
Yeah.
like what was reasonable?
That was one of them, yeah. What was a reasonable number? And then what do we mean by crossing the digital divide? How many things had to happen to indicate that we had crossed the divide? And so we had definitions for all of those. And then the people who signed, their teams and groups had to work on these things. Kuala Lumpur happened to be a regional office, and so the people who were in that meeting, in that room, we also had the Africa region in there as well, where we had most of the digital divide problems. You know, they all had to agree, yeah, this would be meaningful, and we can do this. So yeah, picking an objective that's meaningful progress, but still viewed as doable, we can make this happen, becomes important to making a commitment. Right? If you don't think you can achieve it, if you think it's too wild a goal, what are your chances of working hard on it? Are you going to be in the position where, 6 months into this, see, I told you so, this wasn't going to work? Or like the one sailor who said when Shackleton went off on the card boat at the end, well, I guess that's the last we've seen of him, type of thing. He didn't believe they were going to achieve the goal. So the buy-in stuff may make sense, and the Tracy Kidder example was working with engineers who were building a microcomputer at the time at a company called Data General, which doesn't exist anymore. But how does that relate to selling? And for many technical people, myself included, selling's an unnatural act. That's somebody else, that's marketing's job. But, they sell, I don't sell things. I don't want to sell things. But think of it as a persuasive case. If you're making the case for your project or for your change, you're having to persuade people to agree with you, and it has a commitment at the end. People sign up and they say, we're going to do this, management says you've got the budget for it. And what about the job interview? So you're promoting selling yourself. You're talking about your experiences, you're talking about your credentials, you're answering the questions that the interviewer is posing at you. And then, isn't the job offer one of mutual commitment? Certainly if the company's making the job offer, they're committing to you. It actually has a legal standing as well, if they've made the formal job offer. And then when you accept that offer, usually you're asked to accept that in writing. Now that commitment has become mutual. You've made the sale. You've persuaded the hiring organization. So one of the most fundamental things we do, especially as you're looking at the graduation and the end of your university tenure, is to complete a sales exercise, a persuasion exercise. We'll practice that, by the way. We've got an exercise where we'll be playing the role of manager, we'll be playing the role of candidate, and then we'll switch and give the other person a chance to do the same. And I'll give you feedback on that. Selling the strategy in 360, I said, has got not only the senior management team, it has your business peers or department heads in the organization if you're the CIO, the customers, and then your own IT team. Because if you've got a great vision and you sell that vision to everybody else and your IT team doesn't buy into it, are you going to be able to execute? No, you're not going to be able to execute. I think it was Teddy Roosevelt, the early U.S. president around the turn of the into the 20th century, turn of the 19th century, who said that if you're running up the hill, every once in a while you got to turn around and see if people are still following you. You may have to stop and go back down the hill a bit, to rally people again, before you go forward. But it's pretty important to know is your team coming along with this. So these are the questions, that an IT strategy answers, and this last one here is the important part that relates to the persuasion or the selling, is that, well, what decisions are required to move forward? Are you clear about what decisions that need to be made? How much money do you need? How much people do you need? How much time do you need? Do you need consulting companies to help on this? What do you need to get a commitment on that increases the probability of success of your project? That's what you're going for in this proposal, and that's the persuasive side of the proposal. Now, you don't have to be a fancy salesperson to do this. I'll break this down for you so that you can see what the steps are that we follow. It's actually in the rubric, which I haven't released yet because the teams need to be finalized before I can release the assignment, because the assignment is at the team level. So as soon as we've done that, then I'll release the rubric on this. But we saw these last week in the IFRC plan that we used. And the conclusion, number 10, is not the end. And that's the key difference from when we do papers in a university. When you complete a paper in a university and you get a good mark on it, you've probably done a good job on the research, and you've done a good job on the literature review, and you've got a good, strong conclusion. It's not enough in business. I don't care whether you're looking for a for-profit or non-profit. You need to be able to get to the decision. And part of what your proposal and your report is doing is to guide management to making the decision you want or you believe the organization needs to make. So the ask is the goal of your team presentations. I would say it's the one thing that you need to be clear of early in your process. What are you asking for? Because everything else in your presentation is going to support that ask. And so the article I wrote about this, and it's in the note section of the slides here, but also in the rubric, is called Working Backwards. And the reason the article that I wrote is called Working Backwards is you start with the ask and then work backwards for all the things you need to support that. Like the benefits, the WIFM, right? What's in it for me? What are the benefits? What are the risks? What else did I look at? What else did the team consider? What were the pros and cons of what we considered? What are we recommending? Who are we? What are our credentials? What roles did we play? What's the title of my project? That's going backwards from the last slide to the first slide. That's an act of persuasion. It's something you're going to have to do multiple times as a member of a team and sometimes as a soloist, regardless of the type of organization you work for. So that's why we practice it here. We all have to do this, and we can all get good at it. It's something that can be learned and we can get good at, and we don't have to be a super salesperson to do it. The Gartner version we looked at last week, but what's the weakness of this approach? What's it missing?
The ask.
Sorry?
The ask?
That's it. No ask. Where's the ask in this? Or as one of the senior managers in our panel, I think I may have told you this already, looked at the team that just finished a really good presentation, but then looked at them and said, so what the hell are you asking me to do? This was a CEO who said this. And it was clear that what he was looking for was, what decision are you asking me to make? Why am I here? I'm here to make a decision. If you're not telling me what decision I need to make, you haven't asked me to do what I'm here to do. Now, Nancy Wheeler, we'll talk about her in a second, and the exercise talks about the elevator pitch as having a hook, a brief description of the product and service, what the target market is, who the competitors are, what revenue we're going to get from this, what resources are needed, what investor payback is going to happen if somebody invests in this, and what is the memorable closing on it, all in less than 2 minutes. You may think that's impossible, but there's actually a competition that happens annually, and one of the popular ones is down at Dayton at the business school just south of here. Some of the videos are absolutely delightful. So you'll see those in the notes of the slides as well. And there's the ask. What resources do we need? Money, people, time, all the typical things. And there's the story, the hook in the beginning. How do you grab somebody's attention? So Aaron Pugh does this wonderful elevator pitch on heated stadiums cushions. And he starts off by saying, being at a game on a cold day and sitting on that metal seat, he said, you're really aware of how cold it is. And so that's the story, and he talks about having that experience, having gone to a game. And I see some of you smiling, so you've had a similar type of experience, If you're not sitting on something other than that metal, it can be really brutal. My granddaughters came to visit, and they went ice skating at the Yost Arena. And they asked whether I was going to go ice skating. I said, no, I'm going to take ice skating pictures. And so I went up on the stand to take pictures, and I sat on those stands above the ice skating rink, and I'll tell you, it was cold. So luckily I had a sweater in my bag, so I put it down on the seat and sat on that. That was my seat cushion. All right, building an evidence base. We talked a lot about this last week, so I'm not going to repeat all of the types of metrics that IT departments can gather and use to report evidence of where improvements have been made and where we need to make improvements. But this was so I did an annual report. It's actually a best practice. I got the idea from the CIO who did the Intel report that we read. She had done a number of reports over the years, and I contacted her on LinkedIn and asked her some questions, about it, and then modeled my annual report after what she had done with infographics and things like that. So I did 6 of these during my tenure, and one of the pages in this is what's called the heat map. Have anybody heard that term heat map before? Right? Yeah. So it's sort of we call it the red, amber, green, or red, yellow, green. And at a glance, so these are 5 years worth of reports, and then we focused in on these key questions, which we tried to make these user interesting questions. So are more beneficiaries being reached, which was our key customer in the developing countries. Is the technology investment growing? Are the customers happy? Are my problems getting solved, et cetera? And then this was a high-level judgment call rating. We had some data behind it to back it up. Of course, senior managers, they look at something like this, what do they focus in on right away? The reds. If you've ever had this experience where when you were in grade school, if you brought a report card home, and you had 5 A's and 1 C, what do mom and dad immediately focus in on? The C. Instead of saying, 5 A's, that's really great, how do we do more of that? That's probably not the way that the narrative goes. And so, we'd have to make a statement about, well, you notice how many more greens there are than reds, but then we'd also have to be able to say, here's what we're doing about the reds. So in this case, we said this was a red, but it's improving. And then it did improve. And then it slipped a little bit, and then it came back. So you can also look across time. Heat maps are a way of visualization that becomes very easy for technical audience, particularly senior management, to look at and get a sense of where you are in dealing with these questions, which they agreed were the key questions for them. Very good.
What constitutes why, like for example, in number 2, a no is red versus in 14 and 15?
Yes. Yeah, so the problem with yes, no, and some is their relative type measures. And so was it a thorough no or a mostly no? And so we were trying to differentiate a bit on that as well. If the management team is investing in more IT, they would expect, and investing in some of your projects, they would expect some of these things to get better, right? So we added these items here. Is IT addressing risks, and are the maintenance costs being managed? Because there were problems that were identified with both of those from an audit that we had. So we added those into the questions. You notice uptime is not in there. What percentage of time are our systems up and available? That's the most common IT measure, but it's not. This is purely questions that users would be able to connect to and understand. Like number 5, are my projects getting done? We had a problem with that. It was like Parts Unlimited is having, right? And then we turned that around as the years went on. So at a glance, you can tell key performance indicators and then how we were doing. Sticky stories. Did one of our authors mention sticky stories?
In the video today.
In the video, it was Jack Welch, he mentioned it, yeah.
He talked
And
about sticky companies, but.
Yeah, right, sticky companies, right, sticky business, right, repeat business, or selling additional products. But there's also sticky stories, and this is just sort of builds on Heller's concept of tell a good story, which we read for today. There's this wonderful book by Chip and Dan Heath. They're brothers, and they made their mother proud by working on not only this book, but about another 6 books together. Chip is at Stanford Business School and a professor there, and Dan is at a think tank at Duke University. So opposite coasts, but they get together. They have these wonderful covers on their books, so they put a piece of duct tape on this one made to stick, to sort of illustrate that. But they can summarize, so, and here they mention JFK's man on the moon speech, the moonshot speech. And they said that sticky ideas, good marketing ideas, but ideas in general that stick, have this success criteria, which they've made into an acrostic here: simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional, and stories. And they call this their success model. And they've got a great way of boiling things down. So they're good at doing a 3x3. In this case, it was a 6. They did, but they boil down. They tell you at the beginning of each of their books. Here's the book in a nutshell. You can read the introduction to the book and you get the whole idea. It's a great book to use as a textbook, right? You just read the introduction, you got it. Everything else supports that. Gary Shea was the country manager at Save the Children in the Dominican Republic. And he told a story about having to drive 4 hours from where the Save the Children office was in the Dominican Republic, in the center of the island, to the coast where there was a hotel where he could get on a payphone and participate in a 1-hour conference call that was then Westport, Connecticut. And then the call would end, and he'd get back in his car, and he'd drive 4 hours back to the office. And so it was a 9-hour day for one meeting. So when we connected the offices, we used satellite technology and other technologies to get a strong internet connection out to these offices. And then we put in a voice over internet telephone that used that internet connection. And now he could have a 1-hour meeting with Westport, Connecticut in 1 hour. He'd pick up the phone, join the meeting, and then when he hung up, he was already there home at the office. And that 9-to-1 savings in time, That's what technology can do. So that becomes an interesting statement, similar to Simon Sinek's why. So why do we do more technology? If we can save our people that much time, isn't this worth doing? Probably pay for itself in a year just on saving of the gasoline driving the car. And this was an unsolicited story that Gary, the countryman, he went on to become the senior vice president of programs before he retired, Save the Children, told about that's why technology was important to him. Okay, and so, telling these stories in organizations, these are the types of stories that an IT department can say. So if we do more things like this, this is the kind of impact we can have. Don't we want to do that? Right? So the Gary Shea story became a key rallying story within the organization. Just another quick view on hype cycles and innovation diffusion. Yes, Adrian.
I thought it was reading about the Dr. Pepper, were they running like a pilot?
Mm-hmm.
So is it, part of the value is one of the tests that works, but then if it does succeed, then those people are storytellers, right? Or that's a story that can be.
Right. Yeah, exactly, yeah. We've already seen this, so I'm not gonna spend extra time on it. But it also raises the question about when is the best time to sell your IT strategy? If all of your competitors are here, you've got a great, we're gonna miss out story to tell, right? If you're here, oh my God, we gotta catch up. Right? So where the organization is can become part of the story in terms of adoption of innovation. And same with the Gartner hype cycle. We viewed ourselves at Save the Children and at the International Red Cross as pragmatic followers. There are innovators and pioneers and first movers and fast followers and laggards and enter late. And a question I raised here is Nicholas Carr end up falling in that category if he's saying, delay getting into IT because it's, or new things in IT because it's all a utility. This wait until proven usually means the risk has dropped, the cost has dropped. So for a nonprofit organization, that's an easier time to get in. So when to enter that market becomes important. So we need to go late into the cycle, but not too late to become laggards. Right? So that's a bit of a balancing act. Delay until the risk is down and the cost is down, but don't delay to the point where you're a laggard and you're falling behind your competitors. So, for Parts Unlimited, in the Phoenix book, is it better to sell your IT strategy when things are going well or not well? Sorry? Yeah?
I think going well.
Going well. You can make the case when things are going well, you can make the case of we need to do more of this, for example. Anybody have a different perspective on that? All right, Grace?
So I think that, ideally everything's going well and then everyone can go from good to great, but I think in this instance, it's probably easier for him to catch their attention on staffing or capacity issues when it's falling apart. Not that anyone wishes it to be the case, but like we went early on with an intervention for hiring more staff that was ignored and for budgetary reasons. But I think if you look at what the benefit could be of additional headcount versus the loss in like catastrophic business failure, it's probably easier because you can say I told you so to then prove that you need the improvement. Whereas in like this theoretical loss, I think it's hard to get people to act.
So if we get to the point of saying we need to make these IT investments because we need to fix this problem.
I think you'd have to like be able to quantify what the loss will be.
Yeah.
You have to do some sort of estimate on if we don't do this.
And I don't think in the book yet Steve has enough pain. He will. And then it's an important shift, Roberto.
Well, I'm not so sure about that approach, because when things are burning, like everybody's attention is in that, and the least thing they want to hear is spend more money on something, innovate, because it's not related with the problem at that moment. And from my experience, also when you're in a critical situation and then you survive, everybody relaxes and don't touch anything, and they just forget about doing something,
right.
and they are just afraid. So maybe when things are going well and they're bored and they want to do something new, I don't know.
Nick?
I'm wondering for Phoenix if they even have a strategy to sell. No one's talking about long-term goals or like where we want to end up. I mean, outside of like launch Phoenix and get it running or whatever.
Yeah. There's a saying in IT that goes back a number of years that says that if you're up to your butt in alligators, it's hard to remember the initial goal was to drain the swamp. Because you're fighting the problems all the time. Right? So you're right, you don't have a goal orientation. What typically happens when things go terribly wrong in IT in an organization? Who loses their job? Usually the head, right? The CIO. If things go terribly bad, the CIO loses their job, and a new CIO comes in, or if it's the same CIO, they've hired a consulting company to come in and guide the CIO in the right direction. So at that point, where there's a new investment being made in a new CIO or a consulting company, there's an openness to investing in an IT change. And so we call this the honeymoon period. When you're new in a job, you've got in IT, you've got at most 100 days to shift things around and at least have your plan in place to show what you're going to change and improve. So for many CIOs, when they start their job, it's after a major problem has occurred. There it is.
It's around the manual by the quote, right? I actually just looked it up. It's like never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yes.
And so kind of like the idea of, not that anyone would wish for the 2000 recession, but I mean the idea there was like, if you want to pass policy change, this is the time to do it.
Right.
For certain regulations, the time when you have the audience of American people.
Right. Yeah, and the corollary to that was never waste a good audit. So Parts Unlimited has an audit that's probably has too many items to deal with, but and I don't think there's agreement yet. So what are the top 10 items on the audit? But it would become a important discussion to say, well, what IT projects are we doing to take those 10, address those 10 issues? So, in conclusion, selling the strategy is about persuasion, building alliances, building that personal network, providing strong evidence base of data, but also of opinion. Questions or comments before I show the elevator speech video? Okay, given the time, I think, well, let's take a 3-minute break and then come back to the video, and we'll probably make the exercise one that we will do as a take-home. But let's see how much time we have after we do the elevator speech video. All right, let's watch this. Let's watch this video. So Allison Chadwick is an executive with one of the groups who is, I believe, over Barclays, the holding company. And so this is her talk that's longer than an elevator speech. It's about a little longer than almost 4 minutes long. Oh, let me turn on the closed caption so we can be entertained.
They're so accurate though.
But also, yeah, I mean, the last one wasn't too bad. There were a few choice phrases, but she has a heavy British accent, and so you may find it more difficult to.
Someone. I'm Alison Chadwick.
No, let me start over again. And turn that volume down a little bit.
If you've got an idea for your business, sooner or later you're going to have to pitch it to someone. I'm Alison Chadwick, and I'm talent director for the AMV Group, which is the UK's largest marketing communications group. And as part of my role, I coach people in how to pitch effectively.
Okay, short and sweet. I really like this one. I watched a bunch of them, and I thought this was the best of the class. So here's a summary of these. I'm not going to read through all of them, but ask the question, do any of these things strike you guys odd, or do you have a question about these? Can you see the value of using these in a presentation?
How big is the elevator to say what they wanted to say?
Sorry?
How big is the elevator to say what they wanted it to say?
Oh, and the LED readout?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I went back to the video, right, and paused it after each LED readout and to write down these things. And of course, she did a good job of superimposing on the screen the summary points that appeared, here and there. But here's somebody. So she just gave an instructional video, giving an elevator pitch in under 4 minutes. I think an excellent job. Let me show you a elevator pitch by one of the competitors in the Dayton. This is the 2012 winner, Nancy Wheeler, talking about the Mach 3 ID. So this is a product that they proposed. And so see if she follows the rules or the recommendations that that Allison has made. Okay, so she won $1,500 for this, and I think it was a team project. So she gave the elevator pitch, won the contest, got $1,500 at the University of Dayton School of Business. So here it is in 1 minute, 5 seconds.
Is that a real company?
No, it's proposed. I don't know whether they launched it afterwards. It'd be interesting to do the research to find out. But would you react favorably if you were a venture capital person? No. And why not, Erin?
I thought she was annoying.
She sounded like an infomercial.
An infomercial. Ah.
I think like the reading when they're talking about like authenticity.
Yeah.
I felt like she completely lacked any sort of authenticity.
There was no
It like,
authenticity.
very overpracticed and like.
So was it too polished?
Too polished.
Yeah, it seemed really rehearsed. So.
Okay.
The little slogan at the end.
Little what?
The little slogan thing at the end.
Slogan, yeah.
Watching that dude with the headset thing.
Yeah.
Got
She gives the advertising byline at the end, right? You can picture it on the magazine ad, right?
In her defense, I did like in the time that I've been talking, 17 property crimes, that was a good catch. And
Yeah.
I also did understand it was like concise and short. It was not a bad pitch, but she was just annoying.
Did you get Mary Grace?
I feel like because it's so short, it lacks the ability to have nuance. Like, she doesn't have time to really develop credibility. There's no sort of idea that people would actually adopt this in the market. Like maybe there's a size for it, but it's really unclear if you have some sort of antique furniture, like there's no barcode on that, like what is the feasibility of people's properties, things in people's homes that could actually apply this to? Do most things have barcodes? Probably not, that are really super valuable. And so I think she doesn't really have time to make it realistic to people. And that might be like a problem of this type of setup that kind of leans towards like a pitch man. It's like Billy Mays here, you know? That's what
Okay.
I think it could be a genre, which isn't to say that like it
Right.
is important to have the elevator pitch. I think she just, it's a hard approach in that period of time for what she's trying to sell you on.
Okay, good. Nick?
I also, I don't know how you feel about like her ending with the return and break even part. I feel like she should have ended with that statistic. Since I've been talking this minute, these many people have lost their property, rather than lead with that and end with her estimates on breaking even or becoming profitable. I don't know, like.
Yeah, I kind of agree, like, I just felt like she was just spitting out a ton of facts, like, it was exactly the opposite of what Barkley, video was saying, was like, don't get too in the weeds, don't, like, try to do too much, like, I think she actually could have pitched the idea if she just wasn't trying to be everything, like, she's trying to tell you about return, she's trying to do a clever close, she's trying to tell you, like, all these facts about it, like, I actually got lost halfway through, like, I thought I understood where she was going, and she threw so many statistics that it wasn't until she was like 17 homes or whatever had like an issue now, I'm like, oh, like that's what this is supposed to be doing, because now all I'm getting is just spitting out facts to me.
Okay, Emily and then Rochelle?
I was gonna say something very similar, just like it was actually too much. You could pitch the idea and it should lead people to want to ask more questions, but you don't have to answer those questions in an elevator pitch.
Okay, good. Yeah, there better be a serious report behind this. Because if you're a venture capitalist, you're gonna write the check for $180,000, which is what she was asking for. Right? You want to know that there was a little bit more homework. Rochelle and then Mary Grace.
I actually think juxtaposing the return with the break even weakened her point that we would, you know, make 19 times whatever we invest within 4 years. But then in half that time span, it's gonna take you to just break even. So it just seemed like it weakened the point. If she had just said, we will make 19 times the return within 4 years, I feel like that makes the statistics so much stronger than following with that after saying we will break even in 2 years.
So even reduce that down to one sentence. Yeah. Okay, Mary Grace?
I also think if she's talking about the break even, didn't she only ask for $180,000? So if this is like supposedly some sort of amazing business proposition, and if you're gonna break even in 2 years for $180,000, then it kind of feels like the market's not there to actually support the idea if you're only going to be making like $90,000 a year. Like, I don't know, assuming whatever she's gonna get back and profit on it, it kind of would make me a little bit nervous on that. I also think she could be just as effective if she spent the pitch on really making me believe that this is a product that people want and need. And I felt like, I agree that kind of like some of her stats that she threw out undercut her own effectiveness, whereas she left this presentation with me believing like this is an actual serious need and it's demonstrated that people want this, then I think she could have also been successful.
Okay, good. We can make part of the take home to find another elevator speech that you think does a better job on this and show that. I mean, elevator speeches or pitches rather are a genre that is been made popular by venture capital circles. You know, a venture capital group is only going to get a chance to maybe hear 20 of these, you know, over the time that they're at the university or at wherever they're doing this. And it's sort of like speed dating, you know, can you go through and meet as many proposals as you can and see what you might want to invest in and then dig further into it. Or Shark Tank does a similar thing on television, right? Erin?
I was just curious if you were surprised by our reaction to the elevator pitch.
Well, let me say I'm delighted by the amount of reaction because that means everybody was participating, which means everybody got into it. And if you got into it from a critical standpoint, all the better because that means you're thinking critically, you know, about it. Let's watch now a little bit longer example. Let's watch Martha Heller, who's one of our authors, do one of her speeches.
That was a nice pivot, by the way.
Sorry?
You didn't answer my question.
I didn't answer your question? Well, you know, with all the politics in the news, you know, you have to practice.
It was beautiful.
It's good, the good politics. All right, that was Jack Welch. We'll listen to Steve Jobs at the end, but here's Martha. Okay. So she has a regular podcast that she does at CIO Magazine on the CIO Career Coach. And let's go full screen. Let's see what Martha has to say. Okay, what do you think of that one? Rochelle?
I feel like if the whole thing was flipped, it would be more powerful, because she's really, like, her driving point at the end really resonated with me, but it took so long to get there. And I feel like if she had started with that and then gave good examples, and then kind of rehashed that first point at the end to emphasize, it would make more sense. But I felt like I wasn't interested in the first few minutes she was talking. And then as she started to kind of be like, to answer the so what, then it started to make sense, but not everyone's gonna wait around until you get there. Like, they might lose interest before that.
Yeah. So you definitely don't want your audience zoning out. Erin, what do you think?
I just really liked the point from it. My favorite like graphic was the one where she's like, you don't convince people with like org charts.
Yeah.
And then at the bottom it had like a heart and a brain. I feel like that really resonated with me because it is, you're just like appealing to like the hearts and minds of people at the end of the day, and like so few decisions are actually based on like the content of something versus like how they feel about you and like your few minutes on the stage, like in their presence. Like it's not often not data driven. Hopefully like our careers that may be different, but at least from my personal experience, a lot of it is just like hearts and minds of people.
Yeah. The best you can hope for, I think, in most organizations is that you have both.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Uche, you have a comment? No? Okay, I'm not gonna play the Steve Jobs one, but I'll leave that for the take home. But Jobs is rather famous, as you gather, well, you know already, but if you, from the article that we read for today, sort of a process that he goes up, setting up, you know, so what's the, you know, who's the bad guy? How's Apple swooping in with a solution that, you know, that resolves this great problem? And it's the reason why you all wanna, Simon Sinek says you wanna go buy one. We'll compare the three, and then as I said, I'll add to the rubric to pick out another one that you think might do a better job on the elevator speech. There are some that, as I mentioned, that are quite fun. So, you know, Aaron Pugh's one on the heated stadium seat is sort of fun to watch. And then there's a Josh, and I forget his last name. He won the competition at Utah State University on branding coffee cups for independent coffee shops. And gave one of the best business presentations I've heard in 2 minutes. Let me just talk a little bit about next steps, and then we're done for today. So these questions will be, and completing this grid will be the take-home assignment. It's pretty straightforward and easy to do. So project teams. So there are 9 prompts, and after finalizing the members of your teams, and as I said, I have one more team that needs to finalize, and then I'll release those assignments. But in it, you'll see these prompts. This is a very short summary of the prompts, but the prompts are pretty short anyway. You know, what type of organization? What's the problem? What's the type of organization? And you notice number 9 is if you don't like any of the other 8, your team can define your own for number 9. Okay. Which scenario your team picks is something then we'll need to have done by the 13th. My next meeting on February 6th, we will choose mentors, so you'll know who you're working with among the senior managers, and then you'll know, then your teams need to pick what scenario you want to work on. If you want to do that sooner, that's fine. Yes, Erin?
Do you suggest that we choose our scenarios based on our mentors? Like,
Some teams have done that in the past. They ask their mentor, what's your background on this? Other teams have said, hey, we're really interested in this, and our backgrounds on the team are that it aligns with this, and that's fine. Because the mentors are, I think the mentors I picked are good enough that they can shift, on that. And if they don't feel like they can, or you don't feel like they can, we can switch. I've got a roster of, I think, 25 different mentors we can choose from. And I try to vary them each year because one of the things I ask you to do is, at the end of the semester, is rate them. So by saying, on a 1 to 5 scale, would you invite this mentor back? And if a mentor doesn't get above a 4 or higher on that 5-point scale, I don't invite them back. Okay? I thank them for their work, but I don't invite them back. And I'm not practicing a Jack Welch on that. I don't give them a lot of candor. 5 teams have formed. There's 1 to go. Notice the diversity statement that Team 1 chose, which I think is nice and complete. Team 4 has a shorter one, but also a good one. Look for the diversity of the tech and business rather, diversity as well. So again, I don't want all technical people on a team, so I'm going to look back at the teams to make sure that that's not happening. And then, as I said, we'll choose mentors. The index card survey results, this was published in the slide deck, so you may have already seen this. And time management, which I'm watching the clock on now on the dislikes, to be careful about. A lot of people like movie clips. The Phoenix Project book, they like as well, and the in-class exercises. This is a little bit harder to read. I did this summary of after JL's presentation. I don't have the 1 to 5 ratings on this one. But it was clearly a technical challenge and that came as the #1 thing that was hard to understand. I'm using the Descript software to do a transcript of the entire class, and it tried to make sense out of JL's speech, but then I asked Abreed if she would go through, listen to it, and correct it, so we'll have a transcript of JL's presentation with the questions I was asking through that, so that you'll be able to refer to that also. And then I can see the top rated one was the candidness of the speaker. I think everybody appreciated it. They liked hearing from industry experts were the 2 top ones on the like, so we'll get to hear from some others. But Martha Heller will be here on a video, she confirmed she'll be at a video conference with us in April. So you'll get to ask her why she didn't flip. Why not put the conclusion first, right? Which is what I think what you were saying, which is something that I usually recommend. We're going into operations next. The next steps are all in the class plan, so there's nothing new that's here, but I do need a volunteer to summarize readings for next week. Adam, you got it. Okay, and that's the SWOT. The take-home exercise on the taking and breaking the IFRC strategy down into a SWOT. So I'll give you all of the items, some instructions, and then your task is, and you can work with the partners on this, by the way. Your task is to figure out where on the SWOT diagram those go. You can also work on partners analyzing the 3 videos as well. Okay, and as before with the SWOT analysis, just indicate when you submit it, both of you submit it, and put the head and the header on the top who both worked on it. So you can do it solo, or you can do it in pairs. Questions? All right, we're out of here. Thank you. For anybody that's not on a team yet, if you want to stay up and talk about that, I'm happy to do so.
yeah.